You, Jen, again for accept that recording message. Thank you for having us all. I'm Monique Coleman, and I am a teacher of blind and visually impaired students or low vision students. And I've been in the field for 22 years. Currently, I'm also a doctoral candidate at Rutgers University, and my research has been focused on the experiences and perspectives of Black mothers of blind and low vision students with navigating the school system and advocating for their children. Generally speaking, my research areas are involved with equity issues around race and culture in the field of blindness and visual impairment. And I look forward to speaking with you all about this very important topic.
Hello, everyone. I am Dana Kahn, and I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University for our Master's in Education of the Deaf program. Before coming to Vanderbilt, I worked in the public schools in Cobb County, Georgia, as a teacher of the deaf. I identify as a white hearing woman, and my life experiences have been largely influenced by predominantly white spaces. And so all that to say, I'm relatively new to culturally sustaining pedagogy. So for any of you joining us today who are also new, I'm excited that you've decided to join this session to learn more about helping your students from marginalized communities thrive in school.
Hello, everyone. We're so glad you could join us and especially grateful on a Saturday. I know how much we all have to do on Saturdays. I'm Susan Bruce, and I'm a professor at Boston College, and I coordinate two different programs, one in multiple disabilities, extensive support needs, we now refer to it as, and also one in global perspectives, teaching curriculum and learning environments, which is an online program. My research is on the communication and literacy development of individuals with multiple disabilities, and especially people who are congenitally deaf-blind. I identify as a white, now older woman, and in recent years with a mild hearing loss, progressive, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, and I also concur that you're welcome on Saturday afternoon. I'm Kevin Miller. I am in Lincoln, Nebraska, where it is an unseasonably warm 80 degrees. I remember many times in my life when we had snow by this point. So it's a refreshing change. I am retired. My background is in, I was a teacher of the deaf. I was a speech language pathologist, a professor, and a school administrator, and now I volunteer for many, many different organizations. And I identify as white and male and mostly hearing. I am like Susan, I have a mild hearing loss on the right side, so it causes me some problems when there's background noise. And my pronouns would be he, him, so that is me.
All right, well, just a couple of notes before we get started with the content. First of all, we will be using identity first language throughout the presentation. So for example, we will say deaf and hard of hearing students out of respect for the general preferences of the deaf blind, the blind and visually impaired, and the deaf and hard of hearing communities. We will also be using the acronym CLD, which stands for culturally and linguistically diverse. And I am not sure if you can hear the helicopter in the background. If you can, then I apologize. My office is right across from the helipad at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, so hopefully that will die down in just a moment. Jen already mentioned we do have ASL interpreters, so a big thank you to them today for joining us and providing interpretation. If you did not hear Jen mention it, then you can feel free to send her message in the chat if you need the ability to multi-pin. There are also captions that are auto-generated, so please be aware they might not be as accurate as live captions. And then throughout the presentation, we are going to have a few opportunities for you to participate. And you can choose the way that you are most comfortable participating. You can use the feature in Zoom, the reaction feature of raising your hand if you would like to share with us. You may also put your information in the chat. Or if you just want to reflect on the answers on your own, that is certainly acceptable as well. All right, so for our agenda, we're going to start off by introducing culturally sustaining pedagogy. We'll then go into some very brief information about culturally sustaining pedagogy that is specific to the three categories of sensory disabilities that we are talking about today. Those also have some acronyms associated with them. So we'll be using BVI for blindness and low vision or visual impairment. We'll be using DB for deafblind and DHH for deaf and hard of hearing. We'll then spend the majority of our time reviewing 3 different CSP practices that we talk about in our article. The first one, Kevin will lead us through critical self-reflection, and then Susan will lead us through individualized and personalized literacy, and then Monique will discuss collaborating with culturally and linguistically diverse families. And then at the end, we will wrap up by sharing some resources with you and also hopefully having some discussion about how we might move forward from this presentation. All right, so here's the first question. So again, your choices are to raise your hand to participate or raise your virtual hand to put your answer in the chat or to just reflect on your own. The question is approximately what % of your students have identities that are different from your own? So take a minute to think about that. And see, it looks like a couple of people are adding to the chat. And Jen, I'm going to ask you to help me watch. I can't see everybody on my screen. So if somebody is raising their hand, please let me know. So for me, my students, I would say 100% of them have identities that were different from my own. As a teacher of the deaf, I am a hearing person. And so my students who were deaf all had identities that were a mismatch from my own. Looks like some of you said 80% there. So let's dig into that a little bit. On this slide, there's an image of the front of our article, the cover of our article. It has a kind of hot pink background. And there's a smaller picture on it that shows a white woman working with a Black child. The white woman appears to be hearing and sighted, and the Black child appears to possibly have visual impairment. So that reflects the growing demographics in our larger population. The racial demographics of our students with sensory disabilities are very similar to that of the larger population. Specifically, we have about 40% of are blind and visually impaired students, and over 50% of deaf and hard of hearing and deaf-blind students who are children of color. However, when we look at teachers, the vast majority of the professionals that are working with these children are white. They're also largely female, right? So there's a number of ways that we might have that identity mismatch with our students. So what do we do about that? How do we address that mismatch between the identities of our students and our own identities as professionals? And one of the ways that we're going to do that then is through culturally sustaining pedagogy. So what is culturally sustaining pedagogy? What do we mean by that? I'm going to read an exact quote from our article that Monique wrote for us. CSP advances educational spaces that not only affirm the rich and complex languages, literacies, and cultural ways of students from CLD backgrounds, but it also actively seeks to maintain them. So I think those are the key words there. We're looking to affirm and maintain these different, the cultural ways that are different from our own. Our schools largely reflect white middle-class norms. And so culturally sustaining pedagogy is a way of really fostering and encouraging that cultural pluralism. I also want to mention here that you might hear other terms used. It seems that there's been a progression of the vocabulary that we use to talk about CSP. So one of the terms I used to hear was culturally responsive pedagogy. And again, you can kind of think back on that and go, oh, that just means we're responding to our students, and maybe we need to be doing more than that, right? So then we moved to culturally sustaining pedagogy, but Susan was just mentioning to me the other day, I had not heard of this, but more and more she is now hearing the term culturally affirming pedagogy, which gets at this exact definition that I just read to you, that we want to do more than just respond to our students. We want to really affirm their identities and their cultures. All right, so in this next section, we're going to talk about how CSP relates to each of the three individual sensory disabilities, at least briefly. So with that, I'm going to let Kevin, I'm going to let Monique start us off with blindness and low vision.
Thank you, Dana. So blind and low vision students, I just want to first say, do represent certainly a wide range of functional vision levels, from total complete blindness to visual impairment, the ability to read large print. Then in addition to that, this very low incidence population, it's not uncommon for us to see additional disabilities within this population. So I think that's important to also keep in mind. Then the next point here is that, and this relates to this topic we talk about here in terms of sustaining the cultures and backgrounds that our students bring to the classroom, or wherever we're working with them, whatever spaces we're working with them in, is the fact that blind and low vision students also need to learn the expanded core curriculum. And this is a curriculum that speaks to the needs of blind and low vision learners due to the lack of incidental visual learning that they do not receive. So the expanded core curriculum provides the background knowledge and skills that allow our students to access their core curriculum or access information more generally in all areas, including their independent daily living skills, their travel skills or orientation and mobility. For example, access technology. There are 9 different skill areas that encompass the expanded core curriculum. And what I like for educators in our field to think about is how can we integrate CSP into all of these areas of the expanded core curriculum, because it is so important for our students. And then the last point in this slide that I think is important to highlight here in this conversation is that research has shown that blind and low vision children and youth, or individuals in general, are socialized to perceive race and culture in ways that are similar to their sighted peers. Because I've heard it being asked to me, to other people, not myself, but I've heard it being said in general in the past that, well, why do we need to focus on, race with our students who may not even see race? Why do we need to teach them about race and color if that's not even going to be something that they are using to relate to other people? And so I think it's important just to recognize that race and culture are perceived through our experiences that we have in our homes and communities and schools. And it has already, again, been demonstrated that vision is not a prerequisite for developing ideas about race and culture. It really is about the social milieu in which we all learn and live and grow. So I think that's important. It will certainly lend to the conversation that we have about culturally diverse literacy experiences that we want to expose our students to, regardless of the level of vision that they have. And that's it.
So when we think about individuals who are deafblind, this is a very low incidence population, the smallest disability group, and they are of great diversity, racial diversity, cultural diversity, linguistic diversity, which we haven't talked about too much yet, but we will. And as Monique mentioned, like individuals who are blind, quite a few of the children who are deafblind, at least in the United States, do have additional disabilities, sometimes more than one additional disability to deafblindness. As Americans, I'm not assuming everyone here is an American, but in America, we have had a long history of being a little slow to join others in certain concepts, which actually I find personally upsetting. And one of those movements was the movement toward using the word deafblind as one word so that people stop seeing it in a hyphenated form, which could represent that it's a combination of deafness and blindness. So deafblindness is a unique disability, and you cannot come to understand the child's needs by thinking of it in an additive kind of way. It isn't the effects of the deafness and the effects of the blindness or visual impairment. It's just not, that's not sufficient. When we think about deafblindness, we're talking about the 2 strongest senses for distance learning, both being reduced in functioning, and the effect is highly interactive, and I would say very hard for hearing sighted people like me to even understand. And so for all of us, we learn from the children about how they learn. Also, especially for those of us who are Americans, deafblindness is a touch culture, and that can be very touchy subject within US culture. Sometimes the children get a professional on their team who really isn't so comfortable with touch, yet they need to learn a great deal through touch. And of course, our comfort with touch is a cultural thing in itself. We also don't want to lose sight that there are disability cultures as well, even though we're really focusing mostly on children today. There's also a very important movement, and I'm certainly not one of the experts in this movement. I saw the name of somebody I know who's attending today. She may know much about this than I do. But we do have something that's very important happening in deafblindness, and that is the Protactile American Sign Language movement. And this is shortened, the abbreviation is PTASL. So it's ASL unique for individuals who are deafblind, which reduces the visual nature of sign language. So there's more provided through touch and on the individual who's deafblind's body. And back channeling is one of the concepts that's associated with it. And the idea of this is to provide tactile information that you might miss through because of the deaf blindness. So for example, if someone who is integral to an interaction left the room, you might not have heard it or seen it. And so that information could be provided to you because people who are hearing sighted are able to glean that information so very easily. And what's beautiful about that movement, if it's really been driven by adults who are deafblind, so they're teaching us what they need. It's their voices that are shaping what PTASL is becoming. Experience is really important to concept development, to language development, to literacy development. We learn so much by just observing. And we also learn incidentally, and I sort those two as two different concepts. Incidentally, meaning kind of by hanging around without any real true intentionality, like I'm going to watch you and learn it. That's observational, right? But you're also very intentional. Incidental is all the kind of learning we do kind of by accident, hanging around, and it's quite observational in nature. So individuals who are deafblind have far fewer opportunities to learn in that very easy way that those of us who are hearing and sighted are able to learn. And we need to really respect that. So a tremendous reduction in observational and incidental learning. And we also want to be very mindful about how family cultures, community cultures impact the nature of experiences, the richer rates of experiences that families provide across cultures that we need to respect when we interact with the culture, with the child in school, and also through our literacy lessons. Community experiences are so critical, and what the level of engagement is would be very important to consider. So in terms of deafblindness, two of the areas we always say are greatly impacted are communication and mobility, or we might say orientation and mobility. And because individuals who are deafblind will need some support from individuals who are not deafblind, perhaps, or people who are deafblind and literate who might support them to develop language, for example, or just interact with them and teach them things. And also through their interactions with orientation mobility specialists who may be sighted or not, they have an increased vulnerability to ableism, the practice of individuals without disabilities viewing people with disabilities in ways that really don't promote their well-being and independence. So that's a big issue. So the disability of deafblindness makes one more vulnerable to the ableism demonstrated by people without disabilities toward them. Another important term is audvism, and audvism is the bias of hearing and sighted individuals toward deafblind individuals.
Okay. Well, I'm going to talk about just deaf and hard of hearing and give you just an overview of this group and how this relates to CSP. First of all, there's just a wide range of persons who are deaf and hard of hearing. You have persons who use hearing aids, cochlear implants, and they speak and do not sign. And then you all have people who do not use amplification, do not use cochlear implants, and they use sign language. And then everything in between, you know, people who speak but also sign. But with deafness, you do have a really unique cultural group, deaf culture. And it is gaining more and more attention, probably most recently with the movie Coda, you know, that focused on a deaf family using sign language. And so there are deaf and hard of hearing persons, adults, who identify as culturally deaf. And this usually means that they're using American Sign Language. Not always, but usually. Deaf culture and ASL, American Sign Language, are really intertwined. They really go together. And so this group really is a cultural and linguistic minority. And so if you do have deaf or hard of hearing students, you know, this is a culture that you would benefit knowing more about and finding out, you know, how do they identify? They might identify as culturally deaf, they may not, but certainly well worth finding out more about this. Now, Susan talked about audvism. There is a term called audism, And that really, again, is the kind of the bias towards hearing and not viewing persons who use sign language as on the same level. I guess would be a way to describe it, but a big focus on using hearing and speaking. And in deaf education historically, for decades, especially throughout the 20th century, probably up to 1960, a heavy focus on teaching children to use their hearing and to talk. Now, in the 1960s, there started to be a lot of interest in American Sign Language and a lot of research and study. And so sign language began to be much more valued, accepted. But still, there tended to be a preference for autism speaking. And then finally, just another kind of interesting area is Black American Sign Language. Susan talked about tactile sign language. Well, here's another variant of sign language, Black American Sign Language. And historically, it really came out of, or was certainly supported and promoted through schools of the deaf. And at the time, they were segregated. There were white schools for the deaf, there were Black schools for the deaf. And so the sign language really started to vary between American Sign Language and Black American Sign Language. Now, interestingly, when schools were desegregated, residential schools for the deaf, apparently there were some problems with Black deaf students and white deaf students understanding each other in terms of their sign language. They had grown apart a little bit in terms of the signs they were using and how they were signing. So it's just very interesting. So anyway, those are just three areas in terms of culture with deafness to think about and maybe learn more about, depending on your students.
We have a little video here too of some Black American Sign Language users discussing their experiences with it. Oh, well, I thought we did.
Yes, Black ASL gets looked down upon. And two, what they'll say is that Black ASL isn't nice or clear, or it isn't as explicit as mainstream American Sign Language. Black ASL has a history, it has a culture.
You can see the difference of my signing style and expression in theirs. I can be signing and they'll go, whoa, calm down, you don't need to get an attitude with me. And I'll be like, no, that's how I express myself. I'm just saying, maybe you express yourself differently, but there's nothing wrong with that, So I have to kind of bring it down sometimes.
If a student is from a Black deaf family, they can communicate freely at home. But when they go to a school for the deaf, where most of the people in the environment around them are white, they know they have to code switch to have success in that environment. Many people think the reason why there's something called academic ASL in school, that you can't use Black ASL because it's not formal. That's what people say. But I think that's a mainstream way of thinking and a mainstream way of viewing things. But internally, we know that it's not true. Yeah, I agree with that. But if you want to code switch to try to fit in with what they're saying in society, we have to do that.
With my Black students, I had to explain how academic ASL should be signed. I didn't want to criticize their signing, which is appropriate in a social setting. That's my dilemma. I told them that their signing was fine, but for the academic setting, I had to switch it to a more formal way. Their Black ASL signing was beautiful to watch, but to criticize it for the academic purpose, it just felt wrong.
All right. So that kind of leads us into this next bit of information, which is racialized achievement disparities. I've talked with my co-authors about how Where I live in Tennessee, it's not uncommon to interact with people who feel that something like culturally sustaining pedagogy is just a nicety. And yet we have some significant data, some very concerning data showing that we have racialized achievement disparities in our schools. And again, what we find with our students with sensory disabilities really mirrors the larger population. So for example, I'll just give a couple of examples. One, there was a study done on reading achievement. And in that study, the white, deaf and hard of hearing, blind and visually impaired, and deaf-blind students who met the study's literacy criteria, the white students had a mean reading comprehension score of that was 10 points higher than the Black students and 8 points higher than the Latinx or Hispanic students. The white students were also reading faster than the Black students. We see some other data with high school completion. This is for our deaf and hard of hearing students. But this graph to me really highlights intersectionality. So when we add in multiple marginalizing identities, so particularly what's shown here is identities related to disability and race, we see high school completion rates drop. And maybe even more concerning is in the area of deaf blindness, we don't really even have good information that is separated out by race, really demonstrating that this is an area that's not getting the attention that it requires. So now that you know a little bit about CSP and why it is so important, we're going to go through 3 practices that you can hopefully implement very readily after this presentation. So we'll talk about critical self-reflection, then personalized literacy, and then collaboration with CLD families. And each one of these will start off with one of those questions for you to think about that you are welcome to then also share your thoughts with us through the raise hand reaction or the chat.
All right. What you see before you here is just an example that I took from what's the document is the ASHA, American Speech and Hearing Association, Cultural Competencies Check-in, Self-Reflection. And we have a link for this at the end of the presentation under resources. And I would encourage you to look it up and take this self-reflection test and give you kind of a baseline of where you are at in your understanding of cultural sustaining practices. And so this is just one example because we're talking a lot about language. I'm not really expecting you to answer this question, but I believe that it's acceptable to use a language other than spoken English in the United States. And so with each of the statements on this check-in list, you can strongly agree, agree, unsure, disagree, strongly disagree. And at the end of the document, you can add up those various categories and get a sense of where you're at on the continuum as far as understanding your own culture and other cultures, especially as it pertains to this population. So. All right, so I will talk about critical self-reflection for the next few minutes. In order to get better or be more proficient with culturally sustaining practices, personally, I think you need to start to begin with self-reflection, just looking at yourself and your own culture, looking at your students, their culture, but it begins with reflection. And I mentioned earlier that I'm retired, but I frequently heard people say that you'll be busier in retirement than when you were working. And I have found that to be true. And I find that even though I'm retired, I have to be purposeful about finding time to step back and reflect. And so I do think it is a good idea. I'm presuming most of you are probably working and you're busy, and it is hard to find the time to reflect. So you may need to be really diligent about setting aside time to reflect on your day. But I do think it is something that we all should be doing. For me personally, in 1984, the book The Reflective Practitioner came out, and I was working at New Mexico School for the Deaf, and it was such a different experience for me because I grew up in Nebraska. I'm white. I'm hearing. My first job, I worked as an itinerant teacher of the deaf in Iowa. And so now here I was in Santa Fe, New Mexico, at a residential school for the deaf. My signing skills were not that great. And the student population was much different than what I had experienced previously. I think at that time, probably 60% of the students were Hispanic, probably about 10% Native American, and then I guess that'd be about 30% would be Anglo or white. And I know that that culture was on my mind. I was every day thinking about how can I learn more about these very different cultures I was encountering. And furthermore, when I was an itinerant teacher of the deaf, most of my students were hard of hearing. Most of them were oral or speaking. They used listening and spoken language. A few that were deaf using sign language. Now I was in a totally different situation where most of the students were deaf and a few were hard of hearing, but sign language really was the primary communication modality. So reflective practitioner really helped me to think about my own situation with my own students and to examine their backgrounds, their culture, the curriculum of our school, and the context that we were in at a residential school for the deaf. So even though that book is rather old, it still, I think, is pertinent and relevant. But for me, it came along just at the right time. So with self-reflection, essentially just contemplating yourself and your effect on teaching and learning process, and some important skills needed for self-reflection. And these should look fairly familiar because they're pretty similar to Bloom's taxonomy. And if you think about Bloom's taxonomy, you go from kind of a basic level and work your way up the different levels to really in-depth critical thinking. So for starters, just a self-awareness. And in this case, for me, just exploring my own background more so. I am white, I am male, I am hearing, but there are some unique aspects to my background. My father was a truck driver. He dropped out of high school. My mother finished high school, but she was a church secretary, a very blue collar background. We were middle class, but just barely. And so it gave me a chance just to even look at my own background and how I was similar to other white people, but in some ways different. So once you're able to take a look at yourself, then being able to describe your background, your students, and then being able to critically analyze what you're doing and being able to tear apart those different factors and just take a real close look at how you're teaching and how you may be relying on your cultural background without even realizing it and maybe even elevating it. And so just taking time to look at how you're teaching, especially in terms of cultural issues, but even more importantly, looking at your students and analyzing their backgrounds and what they bring in terms of cultural background, language backgrounds, and how can you capitalize on that? How can those be viewed as assets that you can take advantage of to help educate them? And then, with synthesis and evaluation is bringing all those different factors together and figuring out how to use them most effectively with your students. Okay. With promoting self-reflection, this is one of my favorite quotes, comes from John Dewey. We do not learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. And I think that is very true. And so in a school setting, I do think it's important to develop a culture of reflective practice. And there are different ways to do that. I think one would be potentially like a PLC, a professional learning community. Maybe you could have one that specifically focuses on reflecting on your practices, especially with students who are deaf and hard of hearing. And I think that would be a great way to talk about what are the similar cultural values, but what are different cultural issues that are happening when you have a student who's deaf or hard of hearing. And certainly, as I mentioned before, just understanding one's own cultural frame of reference is certainly where you need to begin. Building on an understanding of students' cultures. Again, with students who are deaf, they do come from different culture backgrounds, especially in these times. But they may not understand their own culture very well because of their deafness. And depending on the parents' ability to communicate with them, they may not have a great understanding of their own culture. And certainly cultural humility is a great quality to have. And that basically means being willing to admit that you don't know what you don't know. In other words, admitting that you don't know much about this culture or that culture. So for example, with deaf culture, being willing to admit, I don't know much about deaf culture, but what are some ways I can learn more? And that would be accessing resources. A good example would be the deaf community, finding deaf adults who might be willing to come to school and be guest speakers. That would be a great resource, as well as we provide some resources at the end of this presentation that also could be helpful in that way. And ultimately, just understanding the world from different perspectives. I have traveled a lot. I've been a visiting professor overseas several times, and I always come away from that experience with just able to look at the world differently when I come home, and to get yourself out of your own world to experience another world, with the ultimate goal of just engaging in practices that support equitable opportunities for students' learning and their well-being. And while you're thinking about your own culture and your students' cultures, this is something you might want to keep in mind. And this is really about positionality as far as a teacher, your relationship with your students, especially in terms of power and privilege, and bias. These are three things you could think about. And so one is on action. And these are really comments or conversations about biases that occurred in the past. And so that's part of that self-assessment, reflecting on your own culture, your students' cultures, but something that maybe you weren't happy about, something happened in the past. Inaction is in the moment, recognizing a bias as it occurs. Now, that's not always easy because you just may not be aware of it. But I think the more you study culturally sustaining practices, the better you are recognizing your own bias and being able to figure out ways to change that or expand it somehow, to diminish it somehow. And finally, for action is understanding a bias, existing bias, but then looking to the future and how can I change that so that my classes are more equitable in the future. And I found this little diagram below that I thought captures this very nicely, with the blue, the what being the on action, the what's happened in the past, and then going to the right, the so what is really the inaction, like the here and the now, what's happening right now. And then the green, the bottom, the now what? In other words, what are you going to do about it? So I think that's a nice little diagram to think about in terms of bias and how you might be able to address it effectively with, again, the end goal of making your classrooms more equitable.
So the next question that we're going to ponder, and if you want to express an idea related to this, please let us know or put it in the chat. How do you address the lived experiences of your students through literacy lessons? I'll give you a moment to think about that. Okay. Excuse me. So I want to speak with you about individualized and personalized literacy. I differentiated those terms, maybe back in 2015. Oftentimes people use these two terms as being synonymous, but they are not. And they've been differentiated in the early childhood literature. So I took their lead in thinking about this, especially relevant to individuals who are deafblind, but it applies to all of the children we're concerned about today. Excuse me. So when we think about individualizing, it's all the things around accommodations, modifications to the curriculum. It could include adaptive equipment, assistive technologies, enlarged print, the type of sign language we might be using with an individual student. When we personalize instruction, it is about their lived experiences, what's important to them, what draws out emotion in them, what do they do that's within the traditions of their family and their racial or disability culture. So it is about lived experiences that are shaped by culture. I want to mention a very important concept. When we create materials, literacy materials especially, that are personalized, we want to be observant of the child. Since we're focusing on children, this could apply to adults as well. And think about the experience, not from our perspective as hearing sighted individuals or white hearing sighted individual, in my case. We want to think about it in terms of what was most important to the child, not to us as a hearing sighted person. So if you were to go to a park with a child, you would attend to what brought the child joy, or maybe what brought just the opposite kind of emotion. What stood out for that child about that experience, not what you observed, not what you were paying attention to it. So it's very child guided in nature. And we know that when we are personalized in our literacy approach, we can create materials that are more exciting to the child, materials that we co-create with the child that allow us to share and build memory with the child, and that are just plain very, very enjoyable for the child. So what I'd like to do next is share briefly two types of personalized literacy lessons: story boxes and experience stories. And the other thing I want to say before we move on is it just occurred to me a couple of years ago when we were pondering about the lack of instructional advice, basically, about how to be culturally sustaining. It just hit me that personalized literacy is something many of us do very, very well. And since I'm focusing on deafblindness, we've been doing it a very long time in deafblindness, maybe even longer than the field of early childhood, but we never claimed it as our own, as something we do well, and we should, because we are very child guided and very concerned about the child's lived experiences and how they're different from ours and how we reflect them in the curriculum. But then it occurred to me that that can be a very strong culturally sustaining practice, can't it? Because if we create a book about a tradition in the family, or a book that not only includes the child's first language, but is more than that, that reflects values. And then we think about saliency and what was most important about a particular experience, we can create something that's very personalized and a very rich practice under culturally sustaining pedagogy. So story boxes. These are a collection of items. First of all, it could be a collection of items that you gather with the child to represent an activity that you shared. You can also do a collection of items to represent a published storybook. You can also create your own storybook, which we'll talk about in a minute with experience books. So when we collect these items, we're going to remember the concept of saliency and collect items that relate to what the child most paid attention to and showed emotion about. Concept of saliency. Best practice, we would co-create the story box with the child. And I want you to know that a variation of that then would be something called a storyboard. And these, if you Google it, you're going to see all kinds of things for sighted children around story boxes and storyboards. But what we do in blindness and deaf blindness is a little bit different. And these can be used with children who are deaf, of course, as well. So on this slide, at the bottom of the slide, you see a commercially produced book and some items that someone gathered to correspond to stories in the book. And this book is significant also because it is a culturally sustaining selection of a book because it represents a marginalized child and their family and their experiences. And the upper right, you see a picture of something taken from the Path to Literacy website, which we have in our resource section, but they have actually a number of materials on how to create story boxes as well as experience books that you'll find helpful. And at the bottom, you'll see bottom right, you'll see a picture of a collection of story boxes. And this I thought was nice. This was from my research. This teacher created story boxes, placed all of the items in the blue bins, and then she saved the red bin because red always meant finished or all done. And she used that identifier of the red in a number of ways to represent the concept of all done. So the beauty of this is that it's located in a place that the child knows, and therefore the child could perhaps request during free time to be read a story by going and touching or pulling out one of the story boxes. So accessibility to physical accessibility whenever possible to story boxes and experience books can really spur the child on to do some nice initiations with us. Experience books then. Experience books are a representation of a lived experience that a child or adult had and presented in a book format. This can include in large print, braille, objects, pictures, drawings. I've even done them with small auditory devices for a child who is able to hear the information that we placed in the book. Again, we're going to remember the concept of saliency, and we are going to select salient aspects of the experience from the child's point of view. It's kind of like, what was the main idea of this experience to the child, not to us? And maybe it's not what we intended to be the main experience, right? I often think of, I'm just rolling in my memory of some things that happened with students that were unintended, and that became the main event of a particular environment in which we shared for that particular day. Not always pleasant either, events in their lives, but important to share memories over later. So again, we're going to co-construct this with the child, and we're going to make them as durable as possible. We're going to think about the motor skills, which we haven't talked about yet, but we want to think about page turning And you'll see an example of how that's facilitated in one of the photographs at the bottom. And again, we want to store these where the child can easily access them. So through this, we're building memories. And I often think about the role of vision and hearing in sharing memories and how that changes who we are. So think of all the times we view photographs or we hear stories about things that happened when we were young. Well, how can we provide those similar memory sharing kinds of experiences for children who are deaf, blind, or deafblind? So on the bottom of this page, we've placed 3 pictures. The first one was a page from well, 2 of them are actually pages from an actual book, 2 different books from a study I did. So the first one was about a walk that they took with the child, and they kept it simple. She had sufficient vision and some reading skills, so they used enlarged print and made it together with her, and she helped to glue the leaves on. So it simply says, we walked some more and saw some trees. So of course there were previous pages. And you can see that it is bound together in like with loose leaf rings, basically those individual rings you can use so that she can move these pages easily, and very low tech, very low cost. Okay. It's not mounted on tri-board or anything that would be more complex. In the middle of the page, you see a representation of an apartment building where a child lived, and they have placed then a tactile marker to show where the child is. So the child could get the sense of exploring up the floors and get a sense of the building. And that would be very important for children who are blind and children who are deafblind. In fact, I think many children would enjoy that so much, just getting a sense of how they fit into the physical environment. The third picture is also bound with the similar rings, and it says, Kimmy puts in 1 candy. So this was part of a book about a vocational task that this young adult performed. And incidentally, it's the same person who went on the walk that I mentioned earlier, although that was a leisure activity. So we can see that they've outlined it with tactile marker and placed a tactile representation in the middle for her to represent the candy, probably a piece of wrapper, if I can recall correctly. So these are books that become favorite books of the children and young adults. And I'm doing a longitudinal case on a young man who's 22 now that I studied in previous years. And he still likes to go back and review with his parents these earlier books, in much the way I think we share these stories in other ways with people in our families. All right, so let's think about cultural representation and exposure through books. So we're thinking about deafness, blindness, and deafblindness, and the importance of having characters with those disabilities in books. We also need to think about the importance of having characters of color, including characters of color who are blind, deaf, or deafblind. We have very little in the way of commercially produced books with characters who are diverse, and this is especially an issue among our commercially produced Braille books. So a lot of growth need in this area. We need to adapt culturally diverse print books with Braille and tactile features as a culturally sustaining practice. We need, in short, to choose books that reflect the worlds of the children we serve. We need to also expose them to other persons' experiences, other worlds, and help them learn and grow from exposure to these different experiences. So there's citation here of mirrors, windows, and sliding doors. We need to think about tactile models, 3D images, multisensory paths, of course, always keeping in mind what types of representations are most meaningful to an individual child. And that will change over time. This slide shows you some online resources for diverse children's books, Children's Cooperative Book Center, Diversity Resources page, Colors of Us with a list of 8 multicultural books featuring blind characters, and Colorin' Colorado, how to find diverse books.
So now we are at another question slide, and I'd like to ask for a little interaction on this question as well. I see there were some comments dropped in the chat about literacy and using individual literacy in ways even beyond that literacy experience, so incorporating it into the students' cues in other areas. And so I thought that was a really great comment to make, that we can really use these objects that come from the story boxes that we create through their personalized experiences and make them a part of either their augmentative communication devices and systems, or their daily tactile calendars, and using those objects to represent their day. So I really like that comment as well. I know that's something that I try to do quite often. And as Susan said, the connection and the meaning is just so much richer and more authentic when we are incorporating those personal objects. So now we're kind of turning again to thinking about, in this case, the families of the children that we work with, and how important when we think about reaching and meeting the needs of our students, they come within an ecosystem of a family. And so it's really important to think about how are we able to effectively engage with culturally and linguistically diverse families. So the question is here, how do CLD families participate in their children's education in multidimensional, often unrecognized ways? Is there anyone that would like to take a crack at raising their hand, their virtual hand, and sharing their thoughts or their responses to this question, or jotting it in the chat as well, dropping it in the chat? There's really no wrong answer to this question or any of the questions we posed. Any ideas? Yeah. So for me, when I think about, and I think for many of us, when we think about parent involvement or parent participation generally, things that come to mind are, well, attending IEP meetings, right? That's a big one for us in special education, or a parent-teacher conference, or a PTA event at a school, or another kind of event that occurs at a school, either in the evening or during the day. We may think about volunteering on a trip, as ways that parents or families are involved. We may think about reading at home. These are all the sort of conventional, traditional ways that we've been taught professionally to think about parent engagement and involvement. And I think that it's important for us to recognize that parents from diverse cultural, language backgrounds, racial backgrounds may have different ideas about participating in their children's education, may support their children's education in ways that we may not recognize from our standpoint as professionals, and certainly within the realm of the school environment in which we work. So when we think about involvement and support for children and working with diverse families, we want to think, what ways are their daily practices in their homes supportive of education that we may not necessarily view as or think about by nature, but if we expand our way of thinking about involvement and support for education, that will allow us to see other ways that families are supporting their children. So for example, if I know that I've worked with families who are primarily, working class families, who may, be laborers, day laborers, immigrant families. But in those families, what happens is oftentimes there is a strong emphasis on education. That does not mean that, oh, I have to sit down and read 30 minutes a night with my child, but it may mean that I'm having conversations with my child about the importance of education as a way of perhaps creating a different path for our family, right? You see how hard our family is working to provide food on the table and to provide your needs, your supplies for schools, and to ensure that you have a roof over your head, all these really important basic necessities that we provide for our children. So having conversations about that and about the importance of education and leveraging opportunities for the family, right? For the family's growth and future are really powerful ways of supporting and inculcating in children the value of education, and motivating children to want to do things like read more or do whatever sort of the scholastic or educational activity is in relevant to their particular needs. So I think we have to really be thinking more broadly again about involvement. And research has shown that so many of our families who come from diverse backgrounds don't feel like what they bring to the table is valued, and may not want to share their ideas about supporting their children because they don't see them being valued at that table when they're sitting with professionals. So that said, I'm going to move on from this slide. I do see some great comments here that I think are really helpful. So continue to drop those comments in and we'll try to get to them, but I don't want to take too much more time. I'm going to move on to the next slide, which continues this conversation, thinking about now what barriers to participation do culturally and linguistically diverse families experience. And without getting too deep into this, we know that some of the most widely known and I should say at least widely researched and recognized barriers are in the area of communication. Things just as simple as having access to an interpreter at IEP meetings or even meetings that are less formal. I remember one time being in an IEP meeting where the CST person who was running the meeting was also being used as the interpreter, and so inappropriate, so unacceptable. But unfortunately, the mother in this case really didn't know to expect better, right? And more from that school district. And so there was information that wasn't relayed to the parent because the CST was wearing both hats in that meeting. So clearly there are gaps in communication that happen when we're not providing appropriate translation, interpretation services to families whose first preferred language may not be English. Bureaucratic processes involved in the IEP is another area that has been shown to create barriers. We know that districts are very focused on compliance, right? That's what special education is really driven on, this idea of IDA compliance. But when we trickle that down to families and the impact that has on the process, families may not feel as comfortable when they're in a meeting in a large table with a bunch of professionals and school personnel that are really getting through this huge complex document with a level of English language and educational background prerequisites that may not even be appropriate for that particular family. So you're already creating barriers with that sort of systemic nature of the IEP meeting. And some of these things, I think it's hard for us as educators to really think about, well, what can we do to change or improve these systems that are in place that are required of the IEP process. And I think a part of it is just as to Kevin's point, and to I think some of the other comments that were made, is to really just be reflective and conscious and think about something as simple as slowing down the pace of the IEP discussion to really stop and ask the questions of parents or the caregiver, whoever's engaged in that meeting, about what they're thinking and really welcoming their input so that, again, they can feel valued in the process. I also think that, for me personally, it's really important. We're going to talk more about this in another slide, but to be an advocate for my families. Sometimes families may not feel that there's someone in that school building that's on their side, so to speak, especially when they're, in challenging, perhaps going through challenges with the school district on a particular issue with their IEP, or they're feeling like perhaps their child's needs aren't being met or their services aren't adequate or appropriate. And I think for us as educators is most of us really are highly valued by the families that we serve, and they feel really it's important for them to feel supported by us as educators. So I think thinking about co-advocacy, and we'll talk a little bit about that in another slide, is really important. But being co-advocates is something that's very important for us to think about. And then economic constraints. I don't really need to say a whole lot about that here, but when we're working with families who, may be poor or low income, there's certainly going to be perhaps childcare constraints around getting to different IEP, whether it's IEP meetings or other events that may occur during the school day or after school. They may have difficulties with transportation. So we're thinking about those sort of constraints. And again, here's where the advocacy hat can come into play for us, where again, we can think about how can we intervene in these very bureaucratic IEP processes and say, hey, to perhaps a child study team member, that this parent may need some different times and more flexibility with when we meet. Or perhaps we do need to think about what services and support systems can we provide for childcare transportation? What kind of organizations can we connect this family to? Sometimes we have to be a bridge in that way as well. And that helps to, again, create those stronger relationships with our families. And then on the next slide, there are a few more barriers that I think are important to raise, and we somewhat touched on throughout this presentation already, but thinking about kind of the cultural mismatch again that is quite common, particularly in our field, and how that creates, because we are human beings, right? We're all cultural beings, and we have our own unconscious biases, and we know societal stigmas and deficit ways of thinking about racialized groups in our country. But those larger kind of conceptual prejudices and biases certainly impact the way educators may view families who come from diverse backgrounds. So really thinking again about reflecting on our views and trying to really think from a standpoint of strength and asset for our families, as opposed to, oh, I know this family is low income, or they're immigrant family, they don't speak English, oh, they're not going to be able to do, this or that at home, or perhaps they just are not, reading at home because they can, and they have these limitations. But again, to flip that switch and think about what these families are doing to support and support their children at home, and the ways that they are working with you as an educator to work towards your shared goals of educating their children. So that also leads to, oh, I'm sorry, there are just two more points in there I just wanted to make sure that I bring out quickly, and that is thinking about sort of cultural views about disability and how that there are differences there as well, that will also impact the way that families may interact with their children, the expectations they may have in certain areas of whether it's like independent living skills that we tend to focus on a lot in our fields, right? This idea of independence and how we expect our students, or we're really working towards independence in all areas for our students on an individualized basis. But we also want to think about, again, that cultural system within that the child is operating within, and how at some points there may be some friction and differences between what a family expects and wants for their child in terms of independence and what we want professionally. And we're going to talk about how to, kind of meet each other and collaborate on that. And, lastly, again, there's another area where we see barriers for meaningful participation is when teachers' ideas of or expectations of families and parents may be different from the parent or family or caregiver involved themselves. And so again, this speaks to, again, I've worked with families, for example, a Jamaican family that I worked with once was surprised that I was expecting them to actually sort of, or asking them to do homework with their children. They said, where we come from, that's not our role, that's the teacher's role. So, it was quite firm that they just did not feel that was their responsibility, and they they had a hard time really processing that. Why aren't you doing your job and focusing on that part? And we will continue doing what we're doing at home, but we're not the teacher. And so, again, having that conversation really helped me to just, recognize and work within that cultural framework. Okay. And so again, carrying on this conversation about collaborating with families, ways that we can sort of work around these barriers and disrupt these barriers, right? So that families can be better engaged. And we have here kind of three main ways. And this is kind of a little fancy matrix on here, just like the last slide, that shows the relationship between all these three areas. And the three areas are asset-based engagement, which I spoke a little bit about, cultural reciprocity, and co-advocacy. So I want to talk a little bit about co-advocacy, which I mentioned before, and then cultural reciprocity. So co-advocacy involves really thinking again about being an advocate for your families. And I know that can sometimes place us in a difficult position, particularly if there perhaps may be a disagreement around a particular service request, for example, that a family is making, or any other number of issues that can come up that create some sort of tension between the family and the school, for example, or school district. I think, again, our important role is to, particularly for families who are already marginalized, is to help them feel like they have someone that's always going to be there to meet them where they are. And that's what co-advocacy is really about, saying, I'm going to meet you where you are, listen to what you want and need, and find a way to make sure that your needs are getting met and that we're respecting and valuing that. So this is really what co-advocacy is about for families who often don't feel like they have someone at the table that can advocate for and with them within the school system, so to speak. It's really important for us to think about finding ways to be that person for our families. And then cultural reciprocity talks about this process of mutual collaboration. So mutually working with families, identifying, and I think that's on the next slide where I get into the steps of cultural reciprocity, so I can move right into that. There are 4 steps to thinking about how we can, again, establish this mutual relationship with families, where we're starting to first unpack and identify our cultural values that we have as professionals, right? And really explain, discuss this, be open with our families about what we are expecting as professionals, whether it's about a particular IEP goal, and I'll continue with this example of an independent living skill because it's an easy one, right? Let's say we want, or one of our goals we want is for a student to, is maybe a bathrooming skill that we want the student to work on. And perhaps the family's not quite there yet or not feeling like that should be a priority. It's important to really be above the table, so to speak, right? And having the conversations about what we want and believe, and then speaking to the caregivers honestly about what they expect and recognizing the differences. And then when we do that, it really kind of just first helps to start break down the barriers and levels, I think, of access barriers to communication. And it also allows the families to feel respected and acknowledged for what they believe and what they desire for their children. So when we do that, it helps to, again, create more openings for mutual collaboration. So that brings us to that 4th and final step, right? After we've identified our cultural professional values and we've figured out kind of how that does or does not fit with what the caregivers are expecting, we acknowledge those differences, and then finally we come up with ways to adapt our assumptions, our expectations to meet the family's value system and their beliefs. So I highly value this approach and thinking about these 4 steps in my interactions with families because it really produces powerful results in terms of that working relationship and that collaboration. And then, thanks, Dana, I'm sorry. and then speaking a little bit more about taking that asset-based approach to families, one of the I think most important ways to get that process started, if you haven't already, but at least to deepen that, enrich that process, is to get to know the families a little bit more. Ask about their beliefs about health and disability. What are their expectations related to their child's education and independence? Have genuine or open conversations. Ask about their prior experiences with schools, both the parents or caregivers themselves. What were their experiences with schools? And of course, what were their prior experiences that they had with their children in perhaps other schools or school systems? And the people in the schools, how are they treated? What were their experiences like? We find oftentimes in marginalized communities, I've had this in my own family, where you have cycles, multi-generational cycles of disenfranchisement, and feelings of disenchantment, to put it nicely, with the school system, right? Understanding that they're knowing and experiencing systematic barriers, and then these experiences get passed down generation to generation. So we have to think about how all of this sort of may impact what our families are bringing to the table in their relationships with us. You can ask about their language use and preferences at home, right? That's certainly important to know. What are their skills and interests? This is important because if you have a caregiver that perhaps enjoys a particular hobby or has a particular skill that they may do in their work, these are wonderful ways to bring them in, bring these skills and a level of expertise that into the curriculum that you design for your students, right? So sometimes I know I have asked, and it doesn't have to necessarily be the mom or dad, it could be a cousin, a grandmother, an aunt, an older sister, brother, sibling, who can come in and lead a particular activity that where they are sharing a particular aspect of that family's life or their job or hobby, and it's so I think valuable for everyone in that space, right? Not just the child that does come from that culturally diverse background, but for everyone, all the children, to learn and grow and develop this cultural awareness, and also language diversity awareness as well. So, this is just a bullet point list, but I believe we have included in our resources some examples of cultural inquiry tools that you can use to really gather more information about your families. I encourage this to be done through informal conversations, just chats that you have. Also an actual cultural inventory that you could give out in the beginning of the school year, or child joins you in the middle of the school year. You can also have an inventory tool that you ask the families to complete for you. Think about this as an ongoing process of getting to know your family families in ways that are just kind of deeper than the surface level of what you're required to do. And then here is an example. Actually, it's an excerpt of a family cultural inventory. I think this is actually just a general inventory, but I had a cultural component to it, or section, where I really wanted to bring out some of the practices that this family engaged in at home that I could use to develop lesson plans and activities. And so it was so helpful to gather this kind of information, which I hope you all can access here, but I'll just read off a couple of the questions. One of the questions here is, what languages are spoken in your home? And I found out in this case was Hindi and English. And the second question is, what family activities and traditions are important to you? And the mom talked about, this was the mother who completed this particular survey, and she said they do a lot of things on the family things on the weekends. They get together with friends for dinner or parties at different houses, and they cook a lot of food and have fun talking and watching TV. She talked about as for their religion, they're Hindu, and they have small shrines in their home. So sometimes they do rituals like chanting and meditation at home. But she said they were not devout Hindus. And this was important because in this case, we were talking about the family of a child who's nonverbal. And so it was very helpful for me to have this additional information, because it allowed me to think about real objects, concrete objects that I could bring into lessons and ways to, again, communicate and express, and have that child also open up and express through their augmentative communication devices. And then the second question is, again, speaking to what are your interests and talents? And I found out this mom loves to cook all kinds of dishes. And sometimes she helps other mothers in her group with preparing big dishes for parties. And that was helpful for me because it helped me to think about, in terms of expanded core curriculum activities, ways that I could engage my student in activities like thinking about recipes for favorite dishes that you like. I know that you're at home and you're observing your mom or helping your mom with creating these meals. How can we bring this into the curriculum? And then the last two questions here, again, I specifically asked about culturally rich materials and resources that perhaps they would like to share. And in this case, the mom says she has some Hindu statues and Diwali cards and a Diwali lamp that, and some fabrics as well that she'd be willing to share. So these were all, really helpful for me, and we're able to incorporate that into the lessons. And then the last question is, again, thinking about what the parent thinks or wants for their child. And I said, how do you think your child's literacy program can be made more meaningful for her and your family? And then she said she wanted her to be able to express herself better using Braille and a computer, and she likes to type, so maybe she can learn Braille or type letters for her favorite aunties. So, again, this is just a really good way to gather information, and I highly encourage for you all to think about ways to gather this kind of information from your families. And then, yeah, that brings us to the resources, the list of resources here that can at least kind of get you started on taking the next step in some of these suggestions that we made, or areas that we've covered for best practices. There is the self-reflection, cultural competence check-in through ASHA, a link to that. There's also a link to the National Black Deaf Advocates website, Council de Manos, which is an organization supporting Latinx, deaf, deafblind, and deaf disabled, hard of hearing communities. There's also a link to the National Center on Deaf Blindness, cultural competence resources, the Pass to Literacy site that Dana I know mentioned earlier, and also the IRIS Center, which includes modules on cultural and linguistic diversity available for professional development credit. And then finally, thinking about call to action. What will you do now? I know we've given you a lot to chomp on and to think about, a lot of information covered in a little bit of time, or packed into a little bit of time, but thinking about whether it's starting with how can I get to know my families better? How can I think about incorporating personalized literacy that reflects culturally diverse sources? These are really simple ways to get started with better engaging with culturally and linguistically diverse families and students. But what are some ways that you think, just thinking about your own current caseload, for example, what are some ways that you might want to get started with culturally sustaining practice based on what we've discussed today? Or something that you've already been doing that connect what we talked about? Yeah, I see Bernadette made a comment about asking for families' needs and thoughts and goals. Yes, I mean, I think that's a really great starting point um, for creating those meaningful relationships. And someone else mentions, Susie mentioned reflecting on, yeah, her own actions. The parent culture survey, yeah, sending that home. That's really a wonderful tool to use as well. And sometimes that parent cultural survey can just be in a phone call too, just kind of having a phone conversation where you get to ask those questions and jot down the family's responses. And sharing resources with your colleagues. Thank you, Katie, for saying that. I think that's also a part of it. That's a call to action in terms of really spreading awareness about CSP in our field in particular, because it's not talked about as widely as it is in the broader education world, so to speak. So yes, thank you, Katie, for that. And letting your supervisor, yeah, Patricia said, letting my supervisor know I need more time with my workload to make connections with families and to be allowed to work outside my duty hours. That is so important. And I'm so glad that you raised that point, because if we're going to really establish these meaningful relationships, that requires more time. and home visits even, let's get back to, it's not just early intervention where we do home visits, but I love doing home visits with those elementary students, with even some middle school age students. And so we get in the homes where we can, or meet families where they can meet us, and have those opportunities to make connections. Anything else? Well, thank you all so much. Dana, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. We appreciate your time, and we hope that you will be thinking about some of the ways that you might move forward from this presentation. I was just thinking personally how at the start of my career, I used to just ignore the cultural backgrounds of my students. I didn't do anything about it. If it sounds like a lot of you are way farther ahead of where I was back then from your comments in the chat. But I certainly appreciate you joining us today and thinking about ways that we might really change this educational spaces that our students are currently interacting in ways for the better, that are not just culturally sustaining, but really culturally affirming for them. So thank you.